record button
Yep,
again.
it's going. Okay, welcome to Contest Antennas, DX or Domestic, What's Your Pleasure, hosted by the Potomac Valley Radio Club. Before we get started, I'd like to review the attendee application one more time that you have on your PC, because we had a couple more people that have shown up. You have a small grab tab that has several functions, and if you look at it, the arrow allows you to open and close a control panel, and you can go ahead and play with that. Click on it and you'll see the panel pop open, and then you can hide it again if you wish. Below that is a square box which allows you to switch between full screen and window mode, and again, go ahead and play with that. None of this will interrupt the presentation. It's just what you see on your screen. The hand icon allows you to raise your hand and lower it if you want to ask a question, and more on that in a minute. You do not have the ability to unmute your mic with the bottom icon. That's controlled by me as the host. Okay, so if you have the control panel open, you'll see a number of panes, and each one can be expanded or collapsed by clicking on the plus minus located on the left of the pane. And the panes you have available, or you should have available, are the attendee, but again, I don't see that one coming up. I apologize for that. The audio, and if you're going to try your microphone, you might want to click on audio setup to make sure that that you have the correct device selected. Otherwise, don't worry about that one. And then the other one is the questions box, and you can type in a question if you have one, but please do not forget to hit return, otherwise I will never see the question. If you have a working microphone, you can ask a question directly to the presenter or host. In order to do so, you must click on Raise Your Hand in the Grab tab. I will unmute your mic and ask you to go ahead with your question. During the presentation, all attendees' mics will be muted to reduce background noise, so you don't have to worry about what's going on behind you. As I said, feel free to play around with the Grab tab and the control panel at any time. It will not interrupt the presentation, unless Dean or I do it, of course. For this presentation, Dean has asked that you hold your questions until the end. Each slide is numbered, so if necessary, jot down the slide number and question, and he can go back to it. So our presenter this evening, as you of course know, is Dean Straw, n6bv. Dean was a senior assistant technical editor for ARRL from 1993 to 2008, specializing in antennas, transmission lines, and HF propagation. He's been truly blessed by the good Lord. How many hams can say that their vocation has also become their avocation? He was the editor of the last 5 editions of the ARRL Antenna Book and the last 4 volumes of the ARRL Antenna Compendium series. He co-authored with good friend K. Charlie Hotel, Simple and Fun Antennas for Hams, or as they called it, the Little Antenna Book with Attitude. Dean was editor for ON4UN's Low Band DXing and K1 Victor Radio's Antenna Zoning, not to mention several stints as editor of the ARRL Handbook. First licensed as Whiskey Hotel 6 Delta Kilo Delta in 1959 at age 12. Dean has been active since then, mainly on HF and mainly in contests, both phone and CW. The vagaries and subtleties of HF propagation and the thrill of the competitive chase have kept his interest sparked in ham radio for more than 48 years. That's fantastic, Dean. Experience in ham radio led him to a degree in electronics engineering at Yale in 1967, where he was active at the Whiskey 1 Yankee uniform club station, operating, as you may guess, in contests. Dean worked in the marine electronics industry for more than 25 years before joining the ARRL staff. Since returning to the West Coast in 1998 from New Hampshire, Dean has ARRL's longest distance full-time telecommuter. And I guess I can only take from that that you were tired of running Europe on 40 meters at 3 in the afternoon, so you headed west.
Ouch.
Yeah. Not many of us would give up a location like that. He operates regularly at n6RO, the contest superstation in the East Bay, or from DX exotic locations around the world. Dean resides with his wife, Rema, in the Richmond district of San Francisco, in a house that looks directly into Golden Gate Park, where he tries to run marathons, albeit slowly. It's still better than I'm doing. He has 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. Dean, thanks for taking the time to join us, and with that, I am going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
Okay, let's see if this all works here. I've participated in several webinars, but strictly in the audience. This is the first time I've actually participated as a presenter, and I'm oddly nervous because I've given, well, probably hundreds of presentations in my time, and I normally don't get nervous, but presented with all this technology and webinars and all this new nomenclature, it's a little unsettling. So bear with me as my nerves settle down a little bit as I get into this. The big difference, of course, is that I cannot see your eyeballs. I cannot tell when your eyes are glazing over, and therefore that I must have said something incredibly stupid, or else that that I need to change the wording of what I just presented. So bear with me again. I appreciate the opportunity and the responsibility of doing one of these webinars. Thank you very much, Ken. All right, gentlemen and ladies, I know that there are people in Europe. It's very early in the morning for you. There are people in Australia, from what I understand, and a whole bunch of you across the U.S. and Canada that are attending this webinar. What I'm going to talk about tonight is HF antennas, and the subtitle is DX or Domestic. What is your pleasure? Let's see if I can control this to get the next slide. Here we go. As I said, I've given hundreds of public presentations, but and you have probably heard me, if you've heard me in other venues, in other public presentations. That is, that if you want to scientifically plan a station, there are a certain number of elements needed to plan that station in a scientific manner. And the first of these is the range of elevation angles needed to cover the areas that you want to cover. The second thing that you want to be able to understand is how your antenna performs, generally speaking, in free space or over flat ground. You want to tell you how your antenna performance varies, and you will generally do that using modeling software nowadays, such as EasyNet or other types of programs that involve numerical electromagnetic computing. The third thing that you'll need to know is the effects of your local terrain. And actually, going back to antenna performance parameters, you can optimize an antenna design in free space and just tweak the very last 0.01 dB out of it. And when you put that same antenna over an actual local terrain that's got bumps and curves and perhaps mountains in the way, you'll find that the performance will change very drastically. So again, you need to know the elevation angles, you need to know the kind of antenna that you're working with, and you need to know the effects of local terrain, which you want to scientifically plan a station. Now, for years, people have told me and very pronounced that for DX contests, you need high antennas, that is, antennas that are high off the ground. Similarly, in the next breath, they'll state that for domestic contests, such as the ARRL November Sweepstakes contest in the U.S. and Canada, or the European Field Day contest, perhaps in Europe, you'll need low antennas. So for DX contests, you need high antennas, and for domestic contests, you need low antennas. And I'm going to examine this tonight. Is this really true? Are domestic and DX contests really mutually exclusive? Now, get to that first point about the range of elevation angles. For more than I care to think about now, but about 16 years ago, I started a detailed study at ARRL running computers. For the first set of computers that I had were relatively slow, 8286 machines, and I remember running one of them for 2 weeks solid without turning off the power once, calculating the range of elevation angles needed to facilitate communications between various portions, various locations, various QTHs around the world. I used then and pretty much still now the so-called IonCap program, which was a U.S. government-sponsored Fortran program. Its latest upgrade is called VOA-CAP, standing for the Voice of America, a computer-aided propagation program. And I also added some proprietary software I wrote for the league to parse and mix and match all the huge data that comes out of the VOA-CAP or the IonCap program. Okay, recently in the last maybe 6 months or so, I upgraded the statistics using corrected loss tables that were in the original IonCap, but somehow that got mangled a little bit when they got transported over to the VOA-CAP version of IonCap. And in addition, because I had much more computer horsepower available at this point in time, I also included more receiving QTHs to add to the databases. Now here's a side-by-side presentation of the old versus the new elevation angle statistics. The ones on the left were the old ones. This is for an 80-meter situation. Let's see if I can get my cursor going here. Okay, 80 meters. What this is saying is that at 4 degrees elevation angle, about 11% of the time that the 80-meter band is open, in this case from W6 from San Francisco towards the European continent on 80 meters, 3.6 megahertz. 11% of the time, the angle when the 80-meter band is open is at 4 degrees. It's a very low angle that's happening. The secondary peak would be about 10% of the time occurring at 9 degrees elevation angle. Well, if you compare the new on the right-hand side versus the old, you'll see not a huge difference, certainly not in the terms of the overall range of angles necessary, but you'll see a little bit more of a bias towards low angles, meaning that low angles are even more important on 80 meters from California to Europe. Just for reference, this is a screen printout from the HFTA program, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, High Frequency Terrain Assessment Program. And it says for a 100-foot dipole over flat ground at, let's say, an takeoff angle of 2 degrees, your gain is minus 13 dBi. That's for a 100-foot high antenna over flat ground, a 100-foot high dipole over flat ground. It's saying that there's not an awful lot of signal you're pumping out at 2-degree takeoff angle. And I'll talk about this in more detail later on tonight. Okay, so the new statistics show a subtle emphasis on lower angles, and also for certain paths, for example, from W3 to deep South Africa on 80 meters, the older statistics would show that there's no signals actually occurring. Then the newer statistics do have less blanks in the statistics for exotic paths on 80 meters and also on 40 meters, because they're looking at more possibilities of receiving QTHs. By the way, to get the new data statistics, you can go to this URL and click on it. You can also find it by looking at the ARRL website and looking for product notes. All right, so let's examine this postulate that even domestic contests get down low. That is, they get down to low angles necessary. Now, you would think that the domestic U.S. or European to European contests involve relatively short distance, and this is true, they do, but they also don't. And one of the reasons is that the continental U.S. covers a large area, 4 time zones in the continental U.S. alone, and if you're in the sweepstakes contest, you're also trying to cover eastern Canada, the Maritimes in eastern Canada, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. So you're potentially talking as many as 7 or 8 time zones in a domestic contest. So the continental U.S. and Europe are fairly large geographical areas. Now, what I'm going to examine in this next part of the presentation is I'm going to use the path from Washington, D.C. to 3 domestic locations. One is to the city of Boston, the next is to the city of Dallas, and then the next is to the city of Seattle, Washington. Here's a little presentation showing, let's see if I can get my cursor back, here we go. Here's Washington, D.C. This is the path to Boston. It's about 294, almost 300 miles from Washington, D.C. to Boston. The path to Texas is in the opposite direction from Boston, and it's about almost 1,200 miles. It's 1,183 miles from Washington, D.C. to Dallas. Then there's a longer distance path that is from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, and that's 2,300 miles. So we've got roughly 300, 1,200, and 2,300 miles are the distances we're looking at for these 3 particular receiving QTHs. All right, let's look at Boston, 294 miles. You think it must be a high-angle path, right? And I hear all of you saying, yeah, that's true, because it is true. Now let's look at the path from Washington, D.C. to Dallas, 1,120, almost 1,200 miles. And therefore, that must be a medium angle path, wouldn't you say? Boston is high angle because it's close. Dallas is a little farther away, so it must be a medium angle path, right? Hold that answer. To Seattle, 2,322 miles. Now that being a longer distance must be a low angle path, right? Well, let's look at some area coverage maps. In the software suite that's called VOA Cap, the general terms VOA Cap, there's a program called VOA Area, which shows area maps and the coverage that you get. And in the next presentation, as part of the presentation, you're going to use this color scheme. A blood red signal is going to be S9 plus 20 dB. This is for 1,500 watts of power. A brown signal is going to be S9 plus 10 dB. A orange is S9, yellow is S7, green S5, light blue is S3, and less than S1 is kind of a grayish color. What I'll do is I'll start with 15 meters from Washington, D.C. This is for the month of November. That is the November ARRL sweepstakes, a domestic contest, for a relatively high level of solar activity, 100, smooth sunspot number of 100. We'll probably see this, we hope, in the next couple years as cycle 24 ramps up. This is for the 15-meter band, 21.2 megahertz, in the afternoon at 21 UTC for 1.5 kilowatts and a 3-element Yagi at 75 feet in the air. The first thing that strikes you about this area coverage map is this large skip zone where you don't have any signals coming in on 15 meters. So from Washington, D.C. to all of New England to all of the Midwest, you're pretty much in a skip zone. But boy, you got nice signals out into California and to the western part of the Midwest. Now, let's take a look at what angles are involved. Oh, by the way, let me go back here. S-dBW stands for the signal in dB reference to a watt. That's what these numbers here. So this blood red color right over here, S9 plus 20, is greater than minus 83 dB reference to 1 watt. All right. Now let's go into the VOA area coverage showing the angles necessary. Again, the skip zone over here around Washington, D.C. shows up nicely, and it says that the angles involved are greater than 30-degree takeoff angle. Let's look over at Dallas, where it's in this blue zone over here, this light blue zone, and it's the takeoff angle is 5 degrees to 10 degrees. Now let's take a look at Seattle, Washington, where the takeoff angle is 10 degrees to 15 degrees. In other words, the takeoff angle to Seattle as compared to the takeoff angle to Dallas is actually higher. Now why would that be so? The reason is very simple, is because the geometry involved with the ionosphere involves a single F2 hop from Washington to Dallas, whereas it involves 2 F2 hops to get from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. So the angles actually are lower to Dallas than to Seattle. Now that's not at first glance intuitively obvious, but that's what the mathematics say. That's what the calculations say. Now, let's look at this again in an HFTA presentation where we're showing the elevation angle statistics necessary for 15 meters over the entire 11-year solar cycle. What, again, these elevation angle statistic is telling you is that 6% of the time, of the overall time when the 15-meter band is open from Washington to across the entire U.S., these elevation statistics in this case are from Washington, D.C. through the entire U.S. 6% of the time, the elevation angle that will be occurring whenever the 15-meter band is open, and that is for any level of solar activity. It's for any hour, it's for any month, it's for the entire 11-year solar cycle. It will occur at 10 degrees takeoff time, takeoff angle. Let's see if I can get my cursor back again. 6% of the time it occurs at 10 degrees. About almost 4% of the time it occurs at 3 degrees. Now this is the elevation response of a 3-element 15-meter Yagi that's 55 feet high over flat ground. So the angles needed go all the way from about 1 degree out to, just over 30 degrees, where they occur at very low percentages of time. But the angles where things are happening, with the meat of the matter, is somewhere between like 2 degrees out to perhaps 20 degrees or so. That's what you have to cover in order to cover all the angles necessary. Now, what I've overlaid here is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek perfect antenna that has a pattern that goes all the way down to 0, all the way out to 33 degrees. And it's got a flat top response, equal response across the entire range of angles. Well, you're not going to find too many antennas like that. We'll examine how best to approximate this ideal, perfect kind of antenna pattern. Interestingly enough, during Dayton, I didn't go to Dayton this year, but W6NL, a dear friend Dave Leeson, gave a talk where he appropriated my fanciful little drawing, and he modified it slightly to emphasize even more that what you need is not necessarily a flat top response, but a response that's boosted up on the lower angles to emphasize even more the lower angles. Okay. That was for 15 meters. Now let's see the elevation angles necessary from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Dallas, and Seattle on 40 meters. Now 40 meters, of course, from Whiskey 3 is in the sweepstakes contest is an incredibly important band. You'll notice that this is at 04 UTC on 7.2 megahertz in November for a relatively high level of solar activity with a 75-foot high dipole at each end of the circuit. And you will see a diminution, that is a skip zone occurring here close to Washington, D.C., but it's not as severe as it is on 15 meters. That's why you guys back east in Washington, D.C. or in Boston do so well on 40 meters, because there's plenty of people to talk to. Whereas on 15 meters, there's only us Californians that you can talk to. So you tend not to go to 15 meters, much to our distress out in California. Okay, let's look at the angles now again. Again, in that skip zone area, the high angles are necessary. High angles necessary higher than 30 degrees. But guess what? Dallas, 5 to 10 degrees. Seattle, 10 to 15 degrees. The same thing is occurring on 40 meters as occurred on 15 meters. That is to say that there's a single F2 hop from Washington, D.C. to Dallas. It's a 2 F2 hop from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. So you still have a situation where the medium distances, that is from D.C. to Seattle to Dallas, are actually lower angles than they are necessary to get farther away, almost twice as far away to Seattle. So now, let's look at the statistics on 40 meters. It says that the elevation angle statistics say that approximately 5.5% of the time when the 40-meter band is open from, in this case, from San Francisco to the rest of the U.S., the angle occurred is 8 degrees, and the secondary peak is about 21 degrees, occurring about 4% of the time. So my question is, how high must an antenna be to cover the 5 to 10 degree area, the sweet part of the elevation statistics on 40 meters? And here I will maintain that 300 feet high looks about right. Now I'm sure if I could see your eyeballs, you'd be groaning right now and saying, I don't have a 300-foot high, Yagi. Well, yeah, very few people do on 40 meters. All right. Now, for my good friends in the Midwest, and I saw W9RE's call sign pop up there on one of the list of the attendees. Oh, Mike, back in the black hole somewhere around Indiana, or maybe let's take Minnesota. What about the antenna heights necessary in the Midwest? Are high antennas in the Midwest good only for DX? And here we have a depiction using VOA area of 14, this is a 20-meter situation in November for a high level of solar activity at 1700 UTC in the afternoon. In this case, I'm using 3-element Yagis at 95 feet. Normally, a 95-foot high antenna of any sort on 20 meters is pretty much thought of as a DX antenna. This is with the signal it lays out into the entire U.S. It lays out an S9 plus 10 dB signal into California, into Seattle, throughout Dallas. It puts pretty powerful signal with only a relatively small skip zone where the signals degrade to only S7 as opposed to, let's say, S9 plus 20 here in the red portion. Now, the angles necessary here, now these angles make a little bit more sense. To Dallas, the angle is somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees. To Seattle, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees. So here we have a situation where from the upper Midwest, on 20 meters, you're using a single F2 hop anywhere throughout the U.S., both to the east and to the west. So these are kind of more typical, traditional kind of what we'd expect to have for domestic contests, the angles involved. And here what I've plotted is from Minnesota, from the top of the black hole in the U.S. By the way, just for explanation to the European audience and perhaps the audience down under in VK that are listening tonight, when we talk about a black hole, the east coast of the U.S. is famous for being able to work. Europe, the west coast of the U.S. is famous for working JA, Japan, and the Midwest is famous for working nothing because they've got a great big black hole. That's where the term comes from, into which they launch their signals, or so they'll say. My dear friends in Minnesota will still do very well from Minnesota. They don't. The existence of the black hole is open to debate, I'd say. Anyhow, from the Midwest of the U.S., a 50-foot high stack. In this case, this is the blue curve showing what happens on 20 meters with a 100-foot high antenna and a 50-foot high antenna in a stack. These are 5-element Yagis. This is the response for the stack for a single 100-foot high antenna, 5-element Yagi at 100 feet high over flat ground. This is the response. It's got a significant second lobe over here. And this is in green is the response of a 5-element Yagi at 50 feet. These are all over flat ground, and it gives you the point I'm making with this exercise. Even a relatively high stack of 150-foot high 5-element Yagis is not too high for domestic use for working sweepstakes contests from Minnesota. Okay, now what about the so-called NVIS, or near vertical incidence skywave? There's on 80 meters and 40 meters where near vertical incidence skywave techniques are used. The close-in QSOs do involve some relatively high angles. For example, this is a population density map. This is from the U.S. Census done back in the year 2000. You can see that the density along the East Coast makes this all the way from North Carolina to even down to Georgia, all the way up to the state of Maine, the so-called East Coast megapolis. That's where the strongest concentration of people live in the United States, and consequently the number of hams also. And the next most high population is in the Midwest here. Now you'll notice that there's a strong concentration of people in San Francisco area. There's a strong concentration in the Los Angeles area. Portland, Oregon, and Seattle over here have strong populations, but there are very little populations except for Boise, maybe Denver. Well, I guess that's Salt Lake City, excuse me, and then Denver over here. So in the middle of the U.S., starting from the California out, let's say, beaming on 80 meters out towards the East Coast, there's not a lot of population density that the West Coast works on 80 meters, whereas on 80 meters from the East Coast, there's a huge population density in New England and in the upper Midwest, and going all the way down to Georgia and Alabama. All right, so particularly the NVIS techniques are particularly useful on 40 meters in the East Coast and in the Midwest with their high population densities. And as I said, the overall population density in the West Coast is relatively low, And what I'm sure you're saying to yourself right now is all those W6s whine a lot about about lack of propagation on, or lack of advantage on 40 and 80 meters. Anyhow, some NVIS techniques are useful even between San Francisco to Los Angeles out here on the West Coast as well. Here's a comparison of two plots. One is, this is on 40 meters from Washington, D.C. on at 04 UTC for a relatively low level of solar activity, just for fun. I show for a 35-foot high dipole, this is the signal strength. It's the S7 in really close to Washington. It degenerates down to S5, goes back up to S7, and then it goes all the way up to S9 plus 20 out here in the water. But out here in the Midwest, it's laying down a pretty good signal for a 35-foot high dipole on 40 meters. Now, if you had, instead of a 35-foot high dipole, you had a 100-foot high dipole, you will notice how the blue skip zone, where the signal is degenerated down to S3 or more, becomes larger, and the coverage into New England and the Midwest is actually deteriorates. So in this particular case, a 35-foot high dipole on 40 meters after sunset, a 35-foot high dipole would beat out a 100-foot high dipole on 40 meters. That's the effectiveness of an NVIS type of antenna. And low dipoles on 40 meters. This is a 35-foot high dipole. It's got a null in the response, but it's not a deep null. It goes down maybe 8 dB. So what my contention is that a 35-foot high dipole you don't even have to really worry about where to point it, because the azimuthal nulls that are present when the antenna is up high don't really exist when the antenna is down low. Okay, now let's look again at talking about antennas for domestic contests. So far, all the scenarios that I've shown you have involved antennas located over flat ground. And I had earlier pointed out when we were talking about the three things necessary: the elevation angles, the antenna modeling itself, and the terrain. Real terrain is a lot more bumpy than flat ground. Okay, I'll introduce you here officially to HFTA, which is a high-frequency terrain assessment program. It is a ray tracing program. And how you can consider a ray tracing program is to use an analogy of a rifle. And I'm going to point up at 45-degree angle and shoot bullets. In steps of quarter degree down from 45 to minus 45 degrees. Then effectively I want to watch how the bullets interact with the ground terrain in the direction that I'm shooting them. Okay, now what HFTA does is for each one of those quarter degree increments, it calculates the reflections and not only the reflections but the diffractions over the terrain. And reflections are easy. Diffractions get really, really hairy. The HFTA program uses a Fortran core. It was originally written in Fortran's an earlier version of Fortran. Now it's Fortran for Windows, but even still, it's an old programming language, but it's still a very powerful programming language when you want to do really heavy-duty mathematics. And HFTA has a Visual Basic wrapper, a GUI wrapper around it for easier operator interface rather than having to deal with the Fortran interface directly. All right, so what it does is it calculates reflections and diffractions over the terrain for these quarter degree increments from plus 45 to minus 45 degrees. Let me give you an example. This is K5ZD, who's up in western Massachusetts. Brandy lives on a neat hill. In fact, his hill, which is about 340 feet above sea level, drops 100 feet in just about 1,000 feet of distance from the tower. This is in the direction of Europe. So his terrain drops 100 feet for 1,000 feet. You will notice, by the way, that the x-axis here, the x-axis goes in this depiction of the terrain profile 10,000 feet, whereas the vertical axis goes from 240 just about 200 feet. It's a different x and y axis. If you were to plot this with this being 10,000 feet and the horizontal also being 10,000 feet, his terrain would look like a straight line with little squiggles in it. But I wanted to emphasize in this depiction of what his terrain looks like close in, so that's why different X and Y axes are used. All right, so this is what his terrain looks like. What does it do to his 20-meter signal? Randy's got a stack of 5-element high-gain 5-element 20-meter beams on a 34-foot boom. He's got a 100-footer and a 50-footer. I'm examining in this drawing, for simplicity's sake, only the 50-footer. And for comparison, this is the 5-element 20-meter beam 50 feet above flat ground, the red one. The blue one is the result of the terrain that he has. And what it's done, if you take the peak at the red, it's about 20 degrees elevation angle is the peak. The peak of this 55-foot antenna and on 20 meters is about 8 degrees. In other words, it's changed 12 degrees due to the slope in his terrain. And it's boosted, it's taken this energy in the top and kind of squished it over towards the left, so that he's got about a almost 19 dBi, 18.8 dBi of gain. Another couple dB, and he'd be in moonbound range with a 50-foot high antenna pointed in this direction. So K5ZD's steep terrain indeed has a major effect compared to a flatland antenna. Randy does real well from that location. Here's W6NL, Dave Leeson's place down in Los Gatos. The mountain overlooking, this is San Jose over here, and this is his location up on top of a mountain. Now his terrain is even more dramatic in that it involves in a 2,000-foot from his tower in the direction, in this case, of the U.S. There's a 700-foot drop in 2,000 feet of horizontal distance from the tower. And again, the scales in the x-axis, or the y-axis rather, and the x-axis are different. This goes out to 14,000 feet, and this goes about 2,400 feet in drop. So again, don't get fooled by the different X and Y resolutions, but it's still a significant, a very significant. You cannot walk up this hill, according to Dave. You can crawl up with ropes up this hill if you, and you don't want to fall off the edge here, 700 feet and 2,000 feet. Okay, now, again, just looking at this QTH from a ham's point of view, you'd think, well, gee, this much of a drop-off means that this QTH is only good for DXing, right? Which normally involves relatively low angles. You'd think that it must be only good for DX work, right? Well, here's what this is on 20 meters, where he's got a 6-element Yagi about 35 feet high. This 6-element Yagi is considerably longer than it is high. And the blue response shows the curve that goes virtually flat from about 3 degrees all the way up to 34 degrees here. And this, by comparison, is a flatland 35-foot high 6-element Yagi. What it's saying is that at, let's say, 3 degrees, the response of the flatland 6-element Yagi is about 0 dBi, whereas that same mountain, it's got about plus 13 dB. So there's 13 dB of difference between a flatland 35-foot high 6-element Yagi and the Yagi actually on W6NL's location at low angles. And of course, as you get up in higher angles, the gain differential goes away compared to a flatland antenna. But here we have a situation where a 35-foot high 20-meter Yagi covers both the low and the high angles well for USA use and for DXing use. It's a remarkable location. He is also extremely strong in the entire Bay Area. He can keep a frequency to himself because he's so strong throughout the entire Bay Area. All right, so how can you achieve high and low angles suitable for both DX and domestic contesting? And as I've been pointing out a little, well, I'll just show in more dramatic detail, higher is sometimes better, but not always. The usual approach to get both high and low angles is to use vertically stacked Yagi antennas. I'll discuss that in more detail here. Stacking isn't the only way, but it has certainly become one of the, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become one of the most popular ways among modern contest stations to cover all the angles is to do vertical stacking of Yagis. Okay, now so let me go over why do we stack Yagis for contest use. Well, first of all, we do it for more gain. We do it to widen the elevation coverage that we want to cover. We do it for what I call azimuthal diversity, that is pointing in different directions. And this is a much more subtle one. We do it for less fading. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, stacking gain. Again, this is a reprise of a slide that I had a little bit earlier for 15 meters. This is a stack of, the green one is a stack of 70 and 35 foot high 3-element Yagis. These are all over flat ground. The red one is a 35-foot Yagi by itself. The blue one is a 70-foot Yagi by itself. And when you stack them, you get increased gain at virtually every angle above, in this case, about 8 degrees. You get, or even 7 degrees, you get significant gain because of the stacking. You'll notice also that the high antenna, that is to say this blue one by itself, a 70-foot high single 3-element Yagi, sets the curve over here on the left-hand limb of this curve for the stack. It determines basically the gain at low angles, and the lower antenna determines the gain at higher angles in the stack. So that, in fact, you'll notice that if you take a look at the 70-foot high antenna, what's happening to the gain or the energy that's at these higher angles is that it's being squished over it's being squished over towards the left to add into the stack. So the low angles are set by the top antenna. The high angles are set by the lower antenna in a stack. Okay, now this is all nice and easy to see on a theoretical point of view. Let's look at the area coverages for these various antennas. This is, again, 21 megahertz, 15 meters in November at a relatively high level of solar activity, 100. This is an 18 UTC in the afternoon using a single 3-element 15-meter Yagi that's 35 feet high. This is the area coverage that it's got. Let's show what happens with a 70-foot high antenna, 35, 70, 35, 70. Now, you'll notice that even the 70-foot antenna has got a kind of a weakness, a belt in yellow here in S7 level. And why does this occur? Because this is the transition between the single F2 hop and a double F2 hop. If you had an antenna that's very high, or that is high on a hill, that has got very good low angle capability, then this would not be yellow. It would be orange in S9 as well. So watch this. Okay, this is 35 foot high, 70 foot high. Let's stack them. Now I've got a little bit more gain. Now let's be radical. Let's put the let's do two things. We're going to go for a longer boom, and we're going to go for a higher stack. In this case, we're going to go for, instead of 3-element Yagis, we're going to go to 5-element Yagis stacked at 30 foot, 60 foot, and 90 foot. For the Europeans, that would be what, 9 meters, 18 meters, and about 24 meters high. We're going to use longer booms to accommodate the 5 elements as opposed to 3 elements. Now compare, this is the 35, 70 foot 3-element 15-meter stack. This is the 5 over 5 over 5 stack, and you'll notice that this hole, this belt of coverage, is better covered by the big stack because it's got higher antennas at the top. Okay, that was 15 meters. Let's look at 20 meters. Here I'm going to do a 4-element 20, similar to a high-gain 204BA, a 4-element 20-meter Yagi at 40 feet high. This is that same Yagi placed at 80 feet high, 80, 40, 80, 40. Stack them. We get more gain, 80, 40, 80. And let's go gonzo and stack 5-element 20-meter beams at 120, 80, and 40 feet. 80, 40, 120, 80, 40. That shows the effects of the stacking. Okay, so let's examine the situation for wider elevation coverage. One of the things that I haven't been specifically pointing out, but one of the things that's been shown in several slides, is that a high antenna by itself, in this case a 15-meter 5-element Yagi at 80 feet over flat ground, has a very severe null right here at 17 degrees. Well, there's a lot of percentage of time when the band is open over the entire U.S., in this case from San Francisco to the rest of the U.S., and where this has a nasty null, whereas the stack, in this case 80 and 40 feet, will help fill in this null, and in fact is about 11 dB stronger at that null point because of the effectiveness of the stack in filling out that null. All right, so let me make the point that higher antennas are not always necessarily better. The gain you get is good at low angles, but the nulls, those nasty nulls, can really get you sometimes. It can really hurt you. And you want to be able to cover all the angles you need with a single stack, so you don't have to keep switching high antenna, low antenna, high antenna, low antenna. A good friend, Ken Wolf, K1EA, once said, if you've got a 120-foot high 15-meter Yagi, you'll probably use it to work the UA6s that are calling you on 15 meters. Whereas you'd use the 60-foot high Yagi to work the Gs on 15 meters. But who's to say that the UA6s only call when you're working with the top antenna, and then the English guys only call when you're working with the low antenna. What you want to do is have them call, have the antennas in a stack so you can cover all the angles you need without switching. All right, and as I pointed out, it's easy to be too high, especially on hilltops. Let me illustrate that for using W6NL's example again. This is for 15 meters, where he's got a 6-element Yagi. I think his 6-element Yagi is 40 feet high, if I recall correctly. That's the green one right over here. Now, if you take the same 40-foot high 6-element and stack above it an 80-foot high antenna, so that you have an 80 and 40 stack, now you get significant increase of gain at the lower angles, which is good, but now you start losing gain at the higher angles, which is not good. So in this case, it's easy to be too high on W6NL's mountain, and that's why Dave has made long boom antennas rather than trying to do much stacking on that mountain. It's just the terrain is just too steep to be effective with a higher kind of stack. All right, azimuthal diversity. That's where you turn one antenna in the stack so you beam two different directions. In this case, I'm beaming east, maybe I'm beaming towards South America from the East Coast. You can cover more directions at once, or you can just simply switch to a single direction on a single Yagi so that you can hear a weak PY that calls you, let's say, in the middle of your European run, and you can hear him better by switching to that antenna quickly. This is a really cool 3D depiction of a stack where one is pointed 90 degrees from the other. The low angle. It takes a little while to understand this because it's a pretty complicated, but it's a really cool pictorial. These are the low angles, hence the high Yagi is most influential there. These are higher angle takeoff angles where the boom of the lower Yagi is the one with most influence. This is when you turn them 180 degrees. This is extremely useful from the East Coast when we're pointing into Japan and a W5 accidentally gets on our frequency and calls CQ. Well, this is when we switch both antennas in the stack, one pointed toward W5 and one pointed toward JA. He gets the idea that there's someone there already working JA's. Okay, now, why do we stack Yagis for less fading? A good friend of mine back in New York has a pair of small Cushcraft A3 tri-banders, and they're only located at 82 feet and 60 feet. They're quite close spaced together, 22 feet apart. And let me read what Don says about the performance of that stack. On all three bands, the stack is always better on northeast path, that is towards Europe, than either antenna by itself. The average signal level benefits from lower and less frequent fades. Peak signal level is sometimes no better on the stack, but it is very seldom inferior. It's surprising how well the stack performs on 20 meters considering the modest 22-foot spacing, but it consistently outperforms the top antenna alone. And the key words to see in here is that even though the peak level is usually the same, but it's never inferior to either antenna by themselves, the effect of the stack is to increase the ability to copy signals in fades. Okay, why does a stack give you better performance under fade? And part of it is space diversity. Even with close spacing, in this case 22 feet, there's enough of a difference in where the antennas are placed that they're receiving different signals. And of course they're doing it at different angles as well. And that tends to fill in the fades that occur on HF propagation. Now, this is my own observation, and you can pull out a complete call sign as much as 5% more often than without a stack. And over a 48-hour contest, that 5% difference can make a huge difference in the actual score. K1ZZ, Dave, for years did not use stacks, and then I persuaded him finally to put up another 15-meter Yagi in his stack, so that he had a 105-foot, 70-foot, and then he finally ended up putting a 35-foot high Yagi also. And what he was amazed is he operated single band 15 meters one time at a DX contest. And his observation was exactly this, that about 5% more often he could get a complete call sign out of the pilot calling, whereas with either Yagi, the high Yagi, the medium, the middle Yagi, or the lower Yagi by itself, he could get most of the time a complete call sign, but not as much as with the stack. Okay, now, and this is a kind of an odd one, but on single sideband, very often the audio that you hear sounds more full, it sounds more rich when you're using a stack, and this is related to less fading is going on, less frequency selective fading. Differential fading is going on. You're quite familiar with the differential fading you have on a shortwave station, an AM shortwave station, when the carrier fades. Then everything is very distorted. Well, on sideband, the frequency response is changed by the characteristics of the propagation channel, and the stack will make the signal sound better, both on transmit and on receive. Okay, antennas for domestic contests could very well be the same antennas you use for DX contesting, that is stacks, with some additions. One of the additions that I talked about here was a 35-foot high, 40-meter antenna for NVIS coverage on 40 and for domestic contesting. And by the way, I'm sure a number of you are probably using vertical four-square arrays on 40 or 80 meters. But here's a trick for you. Put the dump power, that is, if you're using one of the hybrid coupler type of feeding systems, put the dump power, manually switch it, have it available to be switched into a dummy load or into a low horizontal dipole. You will be amazed to see the difference. When I lived back east, I lived in Windham, New Hampshire, and a dear friend, Jack Schuster, W1WEF, lives in Glastonbury, Connecticut, about 120 miles distance between the two locations. We got on 75 meters one night, and Jack was maybe S9 or so, about S9. I could copy him very easily. But I told him, do this trick, Jack, unscrew the coax and plug it into your 100-foot high dipole. And he did that, and his signal came up 20 dB. It was just enough to blow me away, because he was only putting maybe 10 or 20 watts of dump power into the dummy load, and hence 10 or 20 watts of the dump power was going into his 100-foot high dipole. But he really made an NVIS kind of effect come up really strongly. So that's a trick for you sometime. All right. let me summarize that you must cover the full range of elevation angles to all your target destinations, whether you're doing domestic work or whether you're doing DX contesting work. You should know how your antennas work under ideal conditions, that is in free space or over flat ground by means of numerical modeling. You should analyze the effects of irregular local terrain, that's using a program such as HFTA, to optimize your heights of your stacks or even your tower placement on your property. But even more than that, you want to use a program like HFTA before you go ahead and buy that property. A number of people swear by going out with a GPS receiver as they're surveying a new territory or a new place that they'd like to buy out in the country. They take a GPS receiver and note the coordinates where they would be putting an antenna so that they can do a terrain analysis to make sure that that really is the property they want to buy before they buy it. Okay, HFTA is in the ARRL antenna book, and I've got no shame at all. I love talking about the antenna book. It was my baby for 5 editions. It's now in the 21st edition before I retired. All right, now here's a postscript. I know that there's some people in Europe and there's some people in Down Under listening to this presentation. For those of you who live outside the USA, it's always been very difficult to get terrain data digitally on the net. In the US, we've got all kinds of digital terrain data freely available, but it's not so out in the outside of the US territories. And there is recently the U.S. has released the so-called SRTM, the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission terrain data. That's been massaged by a number of different people, mainly some people at a university in London. King's College, I believe is what it is. They've massaged the data, and they have, with permission from the shuttle people, from NASA people, they've released the data. There is a detailed changes made to the operating instruction for HFTA. You can click on this link here, or you can navigate to the ARRL website and look under Support, Product Notes and Updates, find the ARRL antenna book, and look under the addenda for that. That was put up just yesterday, giving you full instructions on how to download SRTM terrain data. Now you should be careful. Even though that's the only data available for much of the world, there are certain provisos. The first is that the U.S. government didn't allow the full resolution that's available in the U.S. On the shuttle data for around the world. It's roughly 90 meter resolution as opposed to 30 meter resolution for the inside the U.S. But still, it's a whole heck of a lot easier than trying to take data for terrain analysis off a topo map of some sort. Okay, well that, Ken, is the end of the presentation, and people are okay, if they've got questions, you go for it.
Okay, great. We have a couple that have come in here already, and if you have questions, go ahead. You can type them in the box and send them to us, or raise your hand and we'll get to you. And let's try Ted Edwards first. Has his hand raised. Ted, I have your mic unmuted. Go ahead.
I just was going on the wrong button. I had no question.
Okay, fine. Put you back on mute.
I like those kind of questions.
Okay. We've got one from Scott, K0 Mike Delta. Dean, can you stack dissimilar Yagis easily, or does it mess up the stack?
Hey, Scott. Good to hear from you again. Dissimilar Yagis, yes, you can, but you had better model them because they generally have different phase points where the driven element is located. And you can sometimes compensate for that a little bit by changing the phase, the phasing, the transmission line that feeds the antenna differentially, adding or subtracting degrees of length that way. But it's not a slam dunk sort of situation. You have to do some experimenting in let's say easy neck.
Okay. Here's one. Great talk. Any recommendations on attic antennas for contesting use? I'm using a vertical delta loop.
Well, obviously my presentation is more for the completely gonzo type of contest operations, but you guys have done very well. Now is this an attic on a in a house that happens to be located on a high hill?
That certainly would help. Okay, another one from Scott, K0MD. Dean, does the type of stacking box, i.e. Comtech, DX Engineering, Microham, have distinct differences in features one should consider?
I've only got experience with a couple of those boxes, not all three, but I think they're designed in very similar manners, Scott.
Okay, here we got one from a familiar call, CT1 Bravo Oscar Hotel, Jose. Dean, if I can select a QTH at 2,000 feet and another at 1,000 feet, is the higher always better?
Hi, Jose. Good to hear from you, my friend. No, it's the slope of the terrain. It's not the exact height of the terrain. That's the start of the terrain. In other words, if you've got a very steep terrain falling off like W6NLs, but that starts at 1,000 feet above sea level, that would be exactly the same effect if that same terrain slope starts at 2,000 feet. They would act in the same manner. It's the height or the change in height as preferably as it slopes away from the tower base that makes the difference. Is that understandable?
Okay, if he has a follow-up question, go ahead and submit that. Here's one that I was kind of interested in. Comes from Carl K1KO. And it says, we always talk about being close to the ocean as being good for our propagation. I'm 2.5 miles to the usual low tide mark, which is due east of me. Does this make any significant difference with the elevation angle? My house is at 4.5 feet average sea level.
No, I don't think it makes much of a difference at all. See, the launch of HF signals into the ionosphere is not much affected by the ground conductivity or the ground dielectric constant for horizontal polarization. And this HFTA only works with horizontally polarized antennas. If you were closer, let's say within a couple hundred feet of saltwater and you used vertical polarization, that's an entirely different subject. The verticals over saltwater are absolute magic antennas.
Okay, one from Frank. Can you generalize the seasonal variation? How would the results have varied for FD, which I assume he means field day?
Well, I presume you're referring to the elevation statistics that are included with the antenna book. They have been done for all possible months, all possible hours, all possible levels of solar activity, with the assumption being made that you don't want to put up a different kind of antenna for every month, or for the ARRDX CW contest, and then put up an entirely new set of antennas rather for the CW portion of the CQ Worldwide contest. You want to put up your antennas and hopefully build them so that they stay there for an entire solar cycle. So do the angles change much for field day as opposed to the November sweepstakes? I don't think they change that much. You still have to cover a wide range of angles because for domestic contests especially, you're covering a large geographical area.
Okay, Jose responded here, I think to your questions, for both QTHs and then same steep slopes. I don't know if there's anything you need to add to those. Okay, let's see here once. Jeff asks, I understand how terrain would affect angle gain, but what about us who live near a large body of water? In my case, I'm 400 feet above and roughly half mile from Lake Superior. So this may have been answered already. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Or?
No, I think that's pretty common kind of a situation. The horizontally polarized antenna will not be affected basically by the character of the ground in front of it, just the shape of the terrain.
Okay, Martin asks, any 30-second tip for references on using long wire antennas for contesting?
Well, no, I don't think I could do it in 30 seconds, maybe 30 minutes.
Okay, we got a little time here if you want to add anything, or I guess we'll leave it at that. Okay, Mark, back to dissimilar antennas. Using a stack match, when I tune the antennas, when I turn the antennas in different directions, what kind of problems may this cause, if any?
Well, you're obviously distributing the power between various antennas in the stack and in various directions. I don't think it causes any problems unless the antennas themselves are very close together, where they might interact. Is provided that your antennas are spaced at least a half wavelength apart, there will be relatively little interaction between them, and consequently the way you turn them should not have a major difference.
Okay, here's one from Ray. Dean, for Ohio and Pennsylvania QSO parties and sweepstakes, he's on the Ohio-Pennsylvania line. I'd like to try a 40-meter NVIS dipole at around 20 to 25 feet with a reflector on the ground. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think you're going to gain a whole heck of a lot by putting that reflector on the ground, but putting in a NVIS dipole 25, 30 feet above ground on 40 will probably surprise you on how well it does.
Okay, John asks if you can comment at all on the pros and cons of cubicle quads versus Yagis.
Well, there's nothing magical about any antenna, whether it's a quad configuration or a Yagi type of configuration. Obviously, the quad was designed at HCJB down in Quito, Ecuador, to live in very high power environment at very high altitudes where corona was a real problem, eating away Yagis, whereas the low impedance loops of quads worked much better. There's a lot of myths and rumors and fantasies about quads working better than Yagis at the same height. Well, modern modeling has proven that that's not true. Quads are, however, much easier to make multiband antennas than Yagis. They seem to be a little bit less sensitive to the interactions between the bands, a little less, I say. The antenna book did quite a discussion about quads and the trade-offs in the performance of quads in Chapter 12. I suggest you take a look at that and play with some of the EasyNEC models that are included on the disc. You'll see what I'm talking about. To put it in a nutshell, quads and Yagis, I'd use both of them. They both work well. There's nothing magic about any of the antennas. However, if you live in an environment where you've got a lot of icing going on, which could very well happen where you are between W3 and W8, I might suggest that quads are a little bit harder to keep up in the air with ice on them than a Yagi is.
Okay, Jay asks, over generally flat ground, what heights do you like for a 3-high stack on the high bands? Now, I think this probably, as your slides pointed out, depends in part on what your target area is. Anything else you'd like to add to that? Or?
Well, back in New Hampshire, when I lived back in New Hampshire about 10 years ago, I had a 3-high stack of 90, 60, and 30-foot TH7s, and those antennas worked very well both into Europe and into the U.S. I could only turn 2 of them, not the third one, but the 90, 60, 30 is a good compromise, it seems, because one of the things you have to watch out from a practical point of view is where you're placing your guy wires, and can you turn your antennas through various guy wires. So 30, 60, 90 tends to be a almost magical kind of number because of practical considerations as well as trying to cover all the angles.
Okay, hang on one second, Mike. We'll get to you next. Ted W4NZ, what are the differences between HFTA versions 1 and 1.04?
I don't think there's much of a difference between them. The basic algorithms remain the same between them. I think there was a bug on the very earliest version, whereas if you put a stack at 90, 60, 30, it operated differently if you put it at 90, 30, 60, something odd, that you wouldn't normally do. That was corrected in 1.04. But basically, the HFTA versions in either the 20th edition or the 21st edition of the antenna book are basically the same.
Okay, Mike, W9RE. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, hi, Dean. Hey, thanks. Very good, informative talk.
Thank you, Mike.
What is your feeling on a two-element Yagi for 40 meters? At 100 feet, you have again, over flat ground, at 100 feet, you have what I call a top hat, right at 90 degrees straight up, as opposed to at 70 feet or 140 feet, you don't have that top hat. What is your feeling for that difference between 70, 100, and 140?
Well, this is for what application, Mike? Work in Europe or working domestic contests?
Well, basically, say a DX antenna.
Well, I mean, and I'm presuming that you'll find that if you do modeling on those over flat ground with EasyNet, that the forward gain is basically the same, no matter what that upper lobe is doing, right?
Right. It's just the fact that, and this is actually, we did this. A friend of mine who did a conversion to a Moxon of a 402 CD, and when we started to look at the modeling, we see this big. He wanted to get it up as high as possible, and you think, well, you want to put it at 100 feet rather than 70 feet, and then we saw this big top hat, and we're questioning it.
Yeah, the top hat would mean that local stations nearby are going to be more aware of you than otherwise, because that's basically an NBIS kind of propagation mode you're directed to. But I don't put much stock in the what I call the ugly upper lobes, because they're always above 60 degrees, and all of the propagation is for DX is less than nominally 35 or so degrees.
Right. I mean, it just you just kind of feel funny that you're wasting all that energy but yet you don't want to lower your antenna from 100 feet to 70 feet.
Yeah, that's right, Mike.
Okay, Mike, put you back on mute again. If anyone else wants to ask a question using their mic, just go ahead and raise your hand. Right, we've got one other question here from Mark. Do the modeling software programs that you spoke of take into consideration guy wires, trees, etc.? Okay,
well, the type of program that I use, and that most guys are using nowadays, is EasyNet. It's a method of moments program. It does not do terrain analysis, but it does interaction analysis between guy wires, let's say, and antennas or nearby antennas or power lines, if you can model your nearby power lines. It does not work with any detuning that might conceivably go on from a tree, though. However, at HF, that's entirely negligible, I'd say, anyway.
Okay, last call. Any questions via the text box? And again, if you type one in, make sure you hit return or raise your hand, and we will unmute your microphone. Just take one last scan here, but looks like we've hit them all, Dean. So with that, I am going to go ahead and take the presentation back, unless you have anything else, Dean. Is there anything else you wanted to show? Or? Well,
no, I think that's about it. I thank you for waiting for me as I get my nerves calmed down in this new method of communication. But hopefully we'll do some more.
Yeah, okay, great. I just, well, let's see if I can, some reason here, I'm trying to pull up my PowerPoint slide. All right. There we go. All right, that's the one I wanted to mention. The upcoming on August 19th with Carl K9LA on cycle 24, and he's going to tell us when that's going to take off. Anyways, again, Dean, great stuff. These tools are really revolutionized our sport and our hobby. It's it's amazing how we've over the years we've really put these tools to use and have really grown our stations and give us a better understanding of how this all ties together. So appreciate you joining us this evening, and for all the work that you've done on this. It certainly improved the sport and the hobby, and just want to thank you for being here and again for all your work.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, folks, thank you for joining us. And again, if you haven't signed up for the August 19th webinar, and I'm also working on programs for September. And if you have any suggestions, I'd be happy to take those. You can email them to me, and at some point here in the next couple of weeks, we'll post the schedule for September. All right, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you next time. So long.